Okay, I figured I would make a video on my way home talking about frequency for powerlifting training or just for strength training and touching on hypertrophy training, just my personal opinion. Seemingly like everything else, I fall somewhere in the middle. I'm definitely not a low frequency guy for the majority of PEEP cases, but I don't take the high frequency approach quite as far as a lot of people do for the average person. Right, there's a lot of variables that are going to impact what frequency you should be training at. Generally speaking, I would say I'm a moderate frequency guy, right? So first we're going to look at factors that are going to lower your frequency from the recommendations I'm going to give lower in the video, right? The biggest one is your absolute strength. The absolute stronger you are, you might have to be looking at a little bit lower training frequencies or using variations to modify a training frequency. So rather than two competition style deadlift sessions, you might have one competition style and one session off of the blocks to make it mechanically a little easier, or use a variation that's going to limit the load, such as like a deficit or a pause, so you can have that like modified frequency. So you're in between a 1 and 2 is kind of how I think about it. So if you're absolutely really strong, if you're a super heavyweight, usually that's going to come with higher absolute loads, certainly. And as well, sorry, someone cut me off. So when you're a super heavyweight, that's going to come with higher absolute loads, and not just supers, just larger guys in general. The absolute loads are higher. Ligaments and tendons take a little bit longer to heal between sessions than muscles do, and absolute load tends to increase the stress on those a little bit. And then also the other thing is, usually the heavier you are, you're a little bit less efficient, right? Like you're gonna be fatter. And usually your aerobic condition is going to be another thing that dictates the frequency that you can handle. So if you're someone who's in poor shape, I recommend fixing that, certainly, and getting into better shape. That way you can jack up your frequency a bit. But you're also going to have to acknowledge that the shape that you can get into is limited by your body weight. And then the third thing that's going to lower the frequency you can handle would be lifestyle considerations. If you're someone who works a very difficult manual labor job and there's a lot of physically taxing stuff going on outside of your training, that's going to lower the frequency that you can train at. If you are limited on sleep or your food intake sucks due to your work, that's another thing that is going to limit the training frequency, right? Considerations that might make it higher, right? So if you're even if you're an advanced lifter, if you're a smaller guy, you might be very good for your weight class, but the absolute loads are lower, right? Which means you probably can sustain a higher training frequency on a given lift, right? Let's see. Females, generally speaking, again, the absolute load is lower regardless of how advanced they are as a lifter, leading to, they can handle a bit higher of a frequency. If you're in really good aerobic condition, that can allow you to train something a little bit more often. And then the last thing that goes one way or the other is your leverages. Someone who's built favorably for a lift can train it a bit more often and a bit harder than someone who's built poorly for it. So, the guy with the typical long-limbed guy might not be able to sustain a true 3x squat frequency without getting really banged up, but he might be able to do 3 competition deadlifts per week. So that's all things you have to consider, right? My general recommendations is going to be 2 or 3 pressing sessions, usually erring on 3, and to the individual, you can make one of those an overhead. You can change the plane of pressing, or you can make all 3 a flat press. Squatting, usually 2 to 3, depending on the person. As low as 1, absolutely, considering the considerations that I mentioned. And then deadlift, I usually go between 1 and 2. And like I mentioned early in the video, you always have the option of doing like a 1.5. So 1 deadlift session, 1 RDL session, right, after your secondary squats or something. So that's certainly a tool you have in your toolbox. We know from, I believe it was a study done on the Norwegian powerlifting team, if you equate volume across the week, when you spread it out, you see better adaptation. So let's say you have 3 difficult sessions. The person who does you got 3 difficult sets per session, right? Or per week. Yeah, 3 difficult sets per week, right? The guy who does all 3 in one session will see a bit worse adaptation than the guy who does 3 separate sessions and does 1 difficult set per session, right? Long story short, if you can split your volume between more training sessions and sustain it, that tends to be a bit better. And I find that if you have a muscle group that you really would like to hypertrophy, whether it be for aesthetic reasons or you feel that increasing the size of a given muscle in the long run is going to be a good move for your powerlifting, I find that taking a higher training frequency and bumping the frequency that you hit that muscle up to 3 times a week also to be very beneficial. So I hope those guidelines kind of help and you can kind of apply all of those things I mentioned and modify them. At the end of the day, trial and error is going to be the biggest thing, and really considering those like 1.5, those half increments of training frequency to really find what is sustainable as you progress best. I'm really big on you don't want to select the training approach that's going to lead to the fastest progress. You're going to select the one that is the most sustainable and just put in the work for a long time, really graft away at it, right? So that applies to a technique, right? So if you have a technique where you're strongest but it really seems to be taxing on your body, you may as well just do the one that's a bit more comfortable and a bit more recoverable and really just get stronger rather than try to use something that's really taxing, because that probably isn't sustainable for you. Right, so in my case, that's why I bench with a closer grip, because who knows, I might be stronger with a wider grip, but I can't put in the same amount of volume without getting banged up, right? So in the long run, I believe it's made me stronger to use the closer grip. You can say the same thing, high bar, low bar, sumo, conventional, depending on the person, it can go either way. But I think those are all considerations, and much the same, you might make great progress pulling from the floor 3 times a week, but can you sustain that? The other thing is what worked for you in the past doesn't work for you now because you're stronger and the absolute loads have gone up. So if you were historically a 3x squat frequency guy, but you're just getting beat to shit and you can't figure out how to modify it, maybe you need to come to terms with the fact that you're stronger now and should be doing 2. So I guess those are all things to think about, just kind of giving you guys my thought process when selecting someone's frequency, and that can change from the on-season to the off-season. There's certainly a lot of things that might fiddle with it, so that's kind of my general thoughts, I guess.